Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think we will start. It's time. I hope it's getting a bit late already, but I hope you're still full of steam. It's only the first day, so even if it's getting a bit late, I hope we can still have you also engaged today. I'm very excited to have this panel today and very privileged to have to moderate it. I'm Brice from Transparency International. I'm leading a work on climate and environmental issues. And I think this panel is very timely, and it's also the first panel of this ISCC to look at the nexus between climate and corruption. I think the topic is getting quite some momentum. I think we saw it also this morning, or we heard it this morning. I think climate and environment was mentioned in most of the interventions, which I can tell you, for having attended a couple of ISCCs, that it's not always the case, or it hasn't been always the case. So I think that's a good thing. I think here we are also hoping to set a bit the scene, but also to hear really much about the role and focus on the role and hopefully the commitments of the different international organizations that are on the panel, who obviously, as you know, have a critical role to play in the response to climate change and how we have to put integrity at the heart and leave no room for corruption. So I will introduce shortly senior speakers here that we have from the World Bank, from UNODC, from the IMF, from UNDP, and from the GCF. Maybe I explain the last acronym for those of you who are not from the climate and environmental field, the Green Climate Fund, which is the biggest multilateral climate fund at the moment. When it comes to this nexus of climate, environment, and corruption, what I came to realize is that it seems that often as if corruption wouldn't be part of it, wouldn't exist. And I think it might be because we're talking about climate, green transition, kind of positive action. And I think that it seems sometimes there's an assumption that we will only do good because we are trying to do something kind of positive, right, transformational. But now we know that, unfortunately, the reality is different. There are a number of initial studies that point to very high level of corruption in the climate domain. Different studies will range from 15 to 20%. There are even some studies on specific samples of climate projects or programs that will talk about 35% or even up to 50% of funding being lost if you can't, mismanagement, let's say. So, and I think probably one of the reasons why is that the climate finance kind of combines or accumulates a few challenges. There is the big volumes that we are talking about that always attract some corrupt individuals or networks, sometimes even criminal networks. There's the pressure to disperse. As we all know, there is a lot of pressure, even if we are far away from the volumes of finance that we actually need. There are new channels, new bodies. There is a lot of technicalities that we won't go into, obviously, today. But that makes the problem complex. And when talking about climate issues, we also refer to vulnerable groups often and remote locations that makes any monitoring, tracking very difficult as well. Last month, we at Transparency International published a first analysis of 80 cases that are included in a climate and corruption atlas that you can find online, and we identified 12 different types of corruption as well as 16 enabling factors of those different types of corruption, and we make some recommendations. And basically what I wanted to mention here is that we see that it's the similar types of corruption that we all know here. So it's kind of a mirror from the climate domain, but I think there is a very singular impact that those types or those corruption cases have, is that they have all a global impact, because it's basically threatening our survival and the success of the fight against climate change. And to put it in a nutshell, I think we can qualify kind of three main ways in which corruption affects climate change, and I think we heard it a bit briefly also this morning, but there is some types of corruption that basically drives climate change and kind of counters the efforts to adapt, to mitigate, but there is also corruption that delays and dilutes the effort to combat climate change. And finally, there is the corruption that reduces the effectiveness and the trust, which is very key in the climate interventions. So I think with this panel, we'd like to kind of go into the question of is there actually, because there is no option as to accelerate the climate flows, as I was mentioning, can we afford to do business as usual? How can we put integrity at the heart of the responses to climate change? What are the kind of, let's say, old tools that we have, but maybe also new approaches that we could come up with? And who else is needed, at least from the perspective of the international financial organizations? So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panel, but first also give special thanks to Alexandra Habershon, the global lead of anti-corruption of the World Bank, who put this panel together and was very instrumental. So we will hear today, to my right, from Francine from UNDP. Francine Pickup is the Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Director of UNDP's Policies and Programs Support Bureau. That is responsible for analyzing global development challenges and providing support to countries and communities. That bureau oversees the global portfolios and funds on environment, finance, governance, and health. And Francine also brings the country-level UN leadership experiences. To my left, Karen from the Green Climate Fund, from the GCF. Karen is the head of the Independent Integrity Unit of the fund, which is, as I mentioned, the world's largest multilateral climate fund. And she previously held some integrity leadership positions with organizations like SOS Children's Village International. We will hear to the left, on my left, on your right, from Tim Steele from UNODC. Tim acts as the chief of the field support section of the corruption and economic crime branch of UNODC. And Tim has been involved in corruption and asset recovery work for 30 years, including the last 8 years on the nexus of corruption and environment crimes. We also have, on the other side, Emmanuel Mathias heads the IMF Governance and Anti-Corruption Division, where he's overseeing the work of the Fund on Anti-Corruption and the Rule of Law. And he previously focused on anti-money laundering issues, which is quite relevant as well. And finally, Robbie from the World Bank. Robbie Sandarovich currently serves as the practice manager for public administration, governance, global practice at the World Bank. And his works include a strong focus on political economy analysis, building coalitions for change, for anti-corruption, and performance-based management of public institutions. So we will have a couple of questions to the panel and then also hear from you if you have any thoughts on the question and especially on the role of that those organizations could or should play when it comes to climate and corruption.
Bryce, I hope that the fact that the IMF and the World Bank are on your right is not a political statement.
Let's see. Depends on your responses. Okay. We'll judge after that. So,
and what does that make?
Just to make sure we speak about the kind of same thing, I would like to ask first what makes climate action different from the other areas of engagement to address corruption, and in your views, in your organization view, what is the main areas that present the greatest risks? Maybe I can start with you, Tim.
I mean, thanks, Brice. I think the question is more, is it different? And the challenge we come with here is climate action is so broad. It encompasses so many different subsets of action. Mineral extraction, procurement, development financing. I'm not giving a complete list here, but it looks across the whole spectrum, and pretty much all economic activity can actually be captured under the heading of sort of action to mitigate against climate change. Obviously, we hear repeatedly, and I think it's true, the fact that it's an existential threat to humanity and the absolute urgency of doing things. People keep saying this, they're not wrong. But in a lot of areas, probably traditional anti-corruption tools work. It is probably quite similar. But I'd like to pick a couple of areas where it may be a bit different. I mean, particularly if you look at, say, the voluntary carbon markets, we've done something quite interesting. We've actually created an ongoing emergency without it actually needing to be an emergency. We've created all the conditions you would see in emergency procurement after a flood, after a natural disaster, when we actually don't need to do it. So that's a bit different. The other thing I think is actually quite a lot different is normally we sit up here and we say corruption is terrible, we should address corruption, full stop. There's a real, and I'm not saying in any way, and not to be construed in any way, that corruption is good, but there's a real challenge sitting here. If we say corruption impacts action to protect the climate, there are those who may jump on that argument and say, okay, so we shouldn't be moving into renewable energy, we shouldn't be funding carbon offset schemes, we shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z because everything's going to be lost to corruption. So one difference that sits here is we need to nuance the argument a lot more carefully than we do in other areas. And I can speak to this for a very long time, and I don't actually have a very long time. What you will see on the board is a QR code. Those of you who want to photograph it, Alexandra, who's been thanked already, her shop and Robbie's shop at the World Bank, ourselves have been, with the help of a lot of you in the room, I thank you for that, have been working on an ongoing discussion draft to stimulate discussion of this issue within primarily the anti-corruption community, but we do want to move across to the climate community in a big way. So please take a photograph of the QR code. You may get some of the participants as well. And please have a look. It highlights what we see as some of the key issues, where we're going. It highlights where we're taking the work next. But please, this is a discussion draft. Your comments are welcomed. It is there to be discussed. It's not meant to be definitive in any way. You can even tell us we think you're wrong. We're happy to have the debate. We're happy to have the argument. If we're talking about it, we're moving. I've probably said enough at this stage. Hand back to Brice.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Maybe because Robbie, you wanted to. I move to you. Same question.
Well, let me start by saying, following what Tim just indicated, that this is a very important agenda that is the confluence of the work of two communities, right? Because for many years, the community working on sustainability, climate change, making the planet a livable planet for all of us, has been very engaged on many topics. And this community here, working on anti-corruption, integrity, transparency, has been very active for many years as well. We are starting now to see the convergence of these two communities coming together with identifying the problems, the risks, and maybe some of the solutions. But to start with answering your question, Brice, I think that, let me tell you a brief story. So the brief story, it may resonate with some of you who run organizations or work for organizations. There was this space agency who needed to hire an astronaut for a suicidal mission. Very difficult mission. So as we do in many of our organizations, I'm sure at the UN as well, they put together a short list. They had 3 candidates, 3 finalists, and interviews go on. So the question was the same question for all. You know, how much do you want for this suicidal mission? And if you get the job, what are you going to do with the money? So the first candidate says, I want $1 million, or euros if you prefer. And the question was, what are you going to do with the money? The answer was, I'll give the money to my family because I may not come back. Okay, fine. Second candidate says, I want 2 million euros. And the answer was, what to do with the money? And the person says, 1 million is for my family. I may not come back. The other million is for my country. They invested so much in me that I want to give something back to the community. The third person says, I want 3 million euros. And then they say, what are you going to do with the money? He says, well, you know, it's 3 million. So 1 million is for my family. I may not come back. The second million is for you to choose me, to select me. And the third million is for candidate one, so he can travel. So basically, what the joke tells is that when it comes to corruption, there is collective action. You need a number of factors to come together in what we call a low-level equilibrium. But people came together and they said, this is the way that we are going to arrange this. The same happens when we discuss climate change. Climate change is also about collective action, and it's about a low-level equilibrium at this point. So if it is about collective action on the problem side, we cannot solve these problems without collective action. So for that reason is that we need more partnerships and the involvement of different parts of society and collective action to be part of the solution to these two issues, and especially when these two issues come together in terms of corruption in climate change. Some of the key differences that we see in this particular sector or problem, first, it affects all countries in the world. It's universal. Other problems, you can see a concentration in some of the countries in the world, but when it comes to climate change and corruption and climate change, nobody is free from it. Second, it affects all sectors in society. In other sectors, you can say it's an education problem, it's an infrastructure problem, it's a water problem. This is all sectors. So the multi-sectoriality of the issue makes it more difficult because you need coordination across different verticals in government, but also across different levels of government. So it's also multi-level in terms of the problem. Third is political in nature. We know more or less what are the technical solutions for this, and yet we are not fully succeeding in implementing these solutions, which points out that the problem is not just technical and the political nature is very important. The geopolitical nature is very important as well. And the transnational nature of this. Corruption has become a transnational issue. Climate change, by definition, is a global issue. So this makes this problem very different. So this set of problems creates also some very specific risks associated with this. The first one is that the poor, the vulnerable, are going to suffer twice. They suffer because of corruption, and we know that, it's well documented. They suffer because of climate change, more than other parts of society, because they have fewer coping mechanisms to adapt to that. When you put them together, they're going to suffer twice, and because of that, for us at the World Bank, it's a very important agenda, because we work in making the world, hopefully, a world free of poverty. Second is other risk associated with this is that this applies not just on the spending side, as Brice, you mentioned at the beginning. There has a dimension on the regulatory side and the regulatory capture on this, issues related to tax expenditures, as we call them, or tax exemptions, sometimes we call them, issues related to the concessional financing for this agenda. So all these issues point out that the issue are not just present on the spending side, on the bribing side, but also on the revenue side, also on the regulatory agencies or function on the private sector as well. So just to conclude, not to make it more difficult as it is now, we are also operating in a very difficult environment, an environment where we also have a constituency of deniers, people who don't believe that this is true. So it makes it more difficult to begin with, and in a context of erosion of public trust in institutions. So we cannot afford to actually have corruption in the climate change transition, because otherwise the whole agenda is going to be, in a way, affected by even lower levels of trust, which are needed actually for collective action. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy. So I stay on my right side then. Emmanuel, do you also share that the IMF the IMF analysis is also, I guess, about trust. And what's your greatest, the greatest risk in your opinion?
Yeah, thanks, Brice, and hi, everybody. As you know, the IMF's mandate is focused on global and domestic economic and financial stability. And we have to ask ourselves questions on how the response to climate relates to this mandate and what are the specificities. And when we look at the specificity of corruption related to climate, we look at the fact that the amounts that are necessary in relation to the response to climate, the lack of transparency of some of the tools, and the amount of discretion that relates to the response make this response quite different than other response. If we go back to these elements, we know that the needs are growing exponentially to respond to the crisis. And by having a lot of funds, this is also a major potential for embezzlement, for fraud. We also see that the different projects, novel projects that are developed have a lot of amount of discretion, both in the spending, both in their design, which also attracts corrupt behavior more than in other areas. And finally, the lack of transparency. We have now a bit of track record, including in the area of deforestation, including in the area of carbon markets, when we have seen how when transparency is missing, the risks of corruption are very important. So the risks that we see as very specific relate to the widespread exposure to corruption of climate policies and the danger it may pose to entire markets. I want to highlight two key factors that lead the IMF's work on climate in general, and they are well known. They relate to interdependency and urgency. Interdependency, obviously, climate affects economies at their domestic level, but the response is not only at domestic level. It involves cooperative efforts from different actors at the national, company, civil society levels in countries and outside of countries. Urgency, as we know, there is the global existential threat. We feel it, we see it more and more, and we, with no doubt, we will see it in the coming years even more acutely. So, to us, this interdependency and urgency have a role in the response. If we focus on one area that is quite important for the IMF, which is climate finance. Climate finance mostly can be mobilized domestically, but many of our member countries need resources from donors and or from the private sector. The investment is mostly upfront, the benefits are mostly medium and longer term. So key issues relate to how have safeguards in place to convince, for example, investors to come in countries where corruption is pervasive, where the state is captured, and where, because, for example, of foreign bribery laws, investors may be worried about the ability not only to recoup their investment, but also their reputational or legal risks. So, before I stop, to finalize on your last question on what are the greater risks. I do think that the greatest risk is not to consider corruption when elaborating general climate policies. I think it's really valuable and important just to have in the back of our mind as policymakers the question of corruption. In some countries, it may not be central. In other countries, it may be critical if we want to have an effective response. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe now moving to you, Francine, from UNDP's perspective, how do you see, do you share also this analysis?
Yeah, I think, as others have said before me, is this space different from other spaces in terms of corruption? I think what makes it important is the scale of the crisis, the climate crisis, and the breadth of the work that needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis. So climate mitigation, adaptation, work around nature and biodiversity, around pollution and waste, and all the different sectors that are relevant for tackling those issues, transport, infrastructure, food, water, energy, and so on and so on. So as others have said, it requires a multidisciplinary approach, a cross-sectoral approach, an integrated approach, which brings more complexity. And then, of course, there's the urgency of the challenge, right? We know that over time, we need to massively ramp up the financing available to address climate. Figures estimate that there needs to be a 5-fold increase in the trillions needed per year over, until 2030 and then 2050 in order to adequately address the problem. So the volume and the speed of the finance needed makes it a special case. And I would say, there is a question. Do we understand the nature of the risks sufficiently? And are we confident that the tools that we have are sufficient to provide sufficient safeguarding and oversight? And I think more could be done in this space to, really make sure that we are ready for the scale of response that is needed. I would make 2 more points. I think one point would be that I know in this and the previous conference, we're starting to look at governance and corruption, corruption and environment, climate issues together. But I still feel the 2 sectors are quite separate, and we're not working in an integrated way sufficiently. And I think we need to do much more to bring these communities together. I think this kind of discussion, having GCF on the panel at an anti-corruption conference is great. And we need much more of that integrated approach. So for example, in the COP discussions or here in the governance discussions, we bring these 2 communities together because we're still not doing that enough. And then my final reflection would just be that given how critical and urgent this sector is, and I didn't mention, but when it comes to energy or when it comes to climate action, the private sector and technology plays a really important part, right? So that's another reason why it makes it quite a specific sector. But can't really emphasize enough the importance of accountability and voice of civil society to oversee action in this space, not just because it's large amounts of money, also because that dialogue is critical to re-establishing that trust between people, institutions that we talked about this morning that we're lacking so much, but re-establishing that trust between civil society and government institutions will be critical so that people can play that role.
Thank you. So now moving to the Green Climate Fund. That's kind of your business to be in responding to climate change. And Karen, you're heading the unit in charge of making sure there is as little space as possible for corruption. So how do you see from your perspective those risks?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with most of what the panel members here, the esteemed panel members, have said so far, especially.
We can disagree as well with each other.
What Francine also has said, thank you. Maybe a little bit first about the Green Climate Fund itself. So for those of you who don't know us, we have been established roughly 10 years ago, and we are the key financial mechanism under the UN Convention on Climate Change, and we are the delivery mechanism under the, in particular, the Paris Agreement. And our main mission is fundamentally to empower our partners to deliver the climate investments to developing countries, to help them to cope with climate change through mitigation and adaptation measures. Now that brings me also to what are the key risks and what is the fundamental difference to other parts of corruption. And that is really, and I think it has been mentioned by some of the panel members before, is really the urgency. So we at the Green Climate Fund, we feel really every day climate change is accelerating. We get more and more requests for access to funding on the climate change. The pressure is extremely huge, and that of course is also a huge risk of corruption. The Climate Fund runs through replenishment cycles. So far we have had 2. The amount is rising of donations that are given to the fund, and we have reached, since last year, we have reached $14 billion. But as Francine also rightly said, the amount that is needed is way higher. And I have actually read the numbers of 2.4 trillion in the next few decades. So that amount, of course, is much higher. The other thing is also for us is the complexity of the projects, the programs themselves, and also the number of partners. We work by now with 129 partners in 129 countries also. The number is also there rising. We have 140 accreditation partners, but because there is so much need for access to climate finance, we have been really asked to accelerate also access to climate finance and think of different ways to access climate finance. And when I see that COP29, I've heard that this has been touted as the climate finance COP this year. There will be even more pressure. But of course, for an integrity unit like us, and I guess for many of you who work in the corruption field as well, with that, the expectation also rises to safeguard that money that is put into it. Because for us, it's really important that every dollar counts. And as sweeping as that statement sounds, may sound to us, this is really important that we deliver it to also to protect the most vulnerable communities. Our biggest investments, or most of the investments, go to the least developed countries in the world, to small island states and Africa. And I guess we are all aware of how hit they actually are. And I think it was Robbie who mentioned climate change is felt everywhere in the world, but it's most felt in those parts of the world where people are the weakest to actually help themselves. So, but the number of partners, the areas in the world where we invest, and then also the sectors in which we invest in all sectors, but that also let's see that the risk of corruption really rise. And the fund, so we have been in existence since roughly 10 years. We have also seen, we have been analyzing a number of annual reports by now, and we see the red flags. So the red flags are the normal, would like to say, corruption areas, but are also really due to the complexity of the projects themselves. There's also the capacity of our delivery partners, and thank God, we have a number of these partners on the panel who are also delivering climate action on behalf or for the Green Climate Fund. But we, of course, also we have a partnership model with bottom-up from the countries that help us delivering or help themselves delivering the climate action. And there needs to be a lot of capacity building also really done from our side.
Thank you, Karen. Maybe moving now to the question of what is your organization doing? So I think you all mentioned the pressure to disperse, the need for acceleration. So how in your organization you make sure the response to climate change is kind of accelerated, but also the kind of management and addressing those risks? Maybe can I start with you, Francine?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So UNDP, we have the largest climate portfolio in the UN system, with funds coming from Green Climate Fund, also Global Environment Facility, as well as from other sources. And we've also, and maybe this is part of the answer in terms of how, we really feel that instead of just working in small projects, there's a need to scale up and work in bigger, more integrated portfolios. That's something I can talk about more, but it's been a big thrust of our work, is to really go above the projectized approach into larger, at-scale portfolios. And one of our global portfolios is what we call the Climate Promise, which is about supporting 125 plus countries, over 80% of developing countries, in designing more ambitious nationally determined contributions, which they can then finance and implement. So we're doing a lot of work in this space, and I would just say that ensuring, doing everything that we can to safeguard the funds and the financing, to protect against corruption, it has to be mainstreamed across all this work we do on environment. So as UNDP, for example, we work at the global level. We're supporting the design of the Loss and Damages Fund. And then at the country level, through things like budget tagging. When I was in Indonesia, we did this. We literally supported the government in tagging each and every single project that it had, whether it had some climate contribution or not, and then tracking and following that. We've done that in countries. Also, Chile is a very good example, and that can lead to really great initiatives, not only overseeing the way projects are implemented, but also leading to things like in Indonesia, the issuance of the first sovereign green Islamic bond, which has now been through multiple issuances. So we work a lot in this space. It's really important to integrate governance and anti-corruption into this work. I mentioned the climate promise that we have. It's our largest global portfolio. Governance is critical to that. If we don't focus on governance as part of that implementation of that climate promise in 125 countries, we're not going to be able to do anything. So that harnessing that political will and making sure that there is strong government capacity and oversight is critical to implementing that climate promise. That's what I wanted to say. Now, beyond that, I would just, I think, mention a couple of points. I think technology and innovation can really, it sounds obvious, but technology and innovation can really strengthen that oversight, transparency, and accountability. So there's lots of initiatives we can do in this space, working with communities so that they can really track, you know this very well, and hold governments accountable for mismanagement, environmental crimes, and so on. So I think that's a really interesting space where a lot can be done. And then, as I said in my earlier intervention, I think we've got a lot to learn in this space, right? So I think more research and evidence should be collected on issues related to environment and corruption, and effective tools to tackle, to map and tackle it. We have the high-level panel forum coming up in July, so next month. And we're actually hosting a session on governance and corruption and SDG 13, and doing some research to prepare for that. So I think this is an important area for further research and data gathering. Let me just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe coming back to you, Karen. What are you doing to address those corruption risks, and who else do you need to work with you?
So basically, what we do at the Climate Fund can be summed up in two parts. So we're really focusing on the safeguarding of the GCF donations and resources that are given to us. And what we are actually trying to do this through also technological and innovative means, like proactive integrity reviews with machine learning and artificial intelligence means. And I think that has been also discussed with panel members and with you, Brice, I think, before. So really, we are conducting these to also prevent actually corruption risk from materializing. We of course still invest in investigations. That's a very traditional part of it. And we're also really trying to ensure that all our partners have in place a robust policy, anti-corruption policy system in place. And here the challenge is really, we need to become really, really targeted. We cannot expect that lots of partners from various cultures can navigate very complex documents. We really need to boil it down. What are the core principles that everyone needs to adhere by? And on the other part, this is really investing more and more, and here we need to do more, is into capacity building. Capacity building really bottom up. We follow the peer learning principles, so we want also partners who realize climate action, that they really learn also from each others across the regions and across really the regions in the world. And then something that I think that we could do way more of, also we here as a group, is investing into international stakeholder management. We, I think, need to work more with each other to understand really the risk, especially in the area of climate finance. And then something that we have started a few years ago, I think it started at COP27, so before I joined the fund, is really the partnership with civil society organizations. Mm-hmm. They help us monitoring projects on the ground. They are local. They understand often way better how the money flows are, how they work. And this is something that we need to really extend. And then really us here on the panel, also the big international partners, we need to understand and work more closely together to understand and mitigate the risks. Thank you.
Maybe back to you, Emmanuel. I mean, we heard about those large-scale portfolio. I guess at the IMF you also have very large funding mechanisms, let's say. How do you ensure that those are also minimizing the risk of corruption? How are you collaborating with civil society or other partners?
No, thank you. So at the IMF we have mainly two policies that relates to this. We have a governance and anti-corruption policy, and we have a climate strategy. And these two policies talk to each other. The governance and anti-corruption policy is really the structural approach to corruption issues. And sometimes some elements of corruption risk in relation to climate may be addressed at the structural level. Climate strategy is, as it says, climate. And there, as we discussed earlier, there is the need to ask ourselves the corruption question. What we have been trying to do is to get a sense of all the macro-critical risks related to climate and corruption. Because for the IMF, macro-criticality is key. We are an organization focused on economic stability at the global and domestic level. So when we see the different phases, corruption can come at the level of the policy making, bribing policymaker to influence policies. It can come in at the moment where the climate finance comes in with embezzlement of this. It can come in at the moment of procurement with bid rigging. And sometimes it's macro-critical when we think of a dam or a seawall or this type of things in small jurisdiction can have percentage of GDP. Or it can come also at the level of weakening or not giving enough to auditing how the projects have been implemented. So we have two main vehicles to look at these issues. One, what we call surveillance. Some of you may be knowing this Article 4 consultation report. So it's an annual health check that the IMF does with each and every of its 190 countries. And so when climate issues are macro-relevant, when corruption to address these issues are deemed severe, we would discuss these issues with country authorities, and the staff will report on a document. Then there is lending, as you hinted. So our lending, different to other international financial institutions, relates to balance of payment issues. So we are not financing specific projects. This said, the risks I mentioned earlier, the structural one, we can address them if we consider that in order for a country to address balance of payment issues, addressing vulnerabilities to corruption related to climate is necessary. And in this case, we would discuss what we call conditions with our member countries to address these. In relation to climate specifically, we have a relatively new financing tool that's called Resilience and Sustainability Trust, where we look at balance of payment issues in the longer term, and then we may have reform measures in this context that address governance weaknesses. I'd like also to say that we cannot do that alone. I think it's really important for us. So in the context of lending, in the context of surveillance, we more and more talk to civil society. We are also more and more trying to do diagnostics to understand the situation, also talking to the business community. We are trying to use our convening powers in relation to climate finance in particular to see where investors are. And I would also emphasize that we are counting on the coordination with other organizations, and first of them, certainly the World Bank. I think we have our clear mandates, but we have a lot of complementarity between us. We were so happy to co-organize at the COP28 what was one of the first events that brought together corruption and climate. We are also benefiting as an institution of the work the World Bank does on climate. They have a fantastic, at least we think it's fantastic, tool that is the climate risk country profiles, which I really recommend that we use in order to inform our work and to see what are potential vulnerabilities, corruption vulnerabilities related to risk. So this is a way for us to try to be stronger by leveraging on the good work that others are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Robbie, are you actually working with Emmanuel or not?
No. I just met him today.
No, just to check. And can you tell us a bit more, and also which cosmonauts are you, or how do you make sure you choose the right one, and with whom are you working?
Okay, so let's start with the beginning, which is I will share something with you that hopefully will stay within the 100 of us in the room. Don't share it, but I always say corruption is not the problem. Difficult to say this in this conference. Corruption is a symptom of a problem. So everything we do at the World Bank on this agenda is to actually tackle the underlying issues that actually produce corruption. Tackling corruption as a symptom is giving a Tylenol when you have fever. You need to actually focus on the root cause and the infection that is underlying there. So to do that, at the World Bank, we have three functions. Maybe we are known because of the first of them, which is the financing. Yes, we do finance projects in developing countries. But in addition to that, we have the knowledge function and the convening function. So it's by using these three functions that we try to advance this agenda as much as possible. So before going to the specifics, I wanted to ask you, do you know how many projects do we have at the World Bank? Let me ask, more than 100? More than 500? More than 1,000? Solved. None. We don't have projects at the World Bank. Countries have projects that are financed by the World Bank. It's like saying that because you have a mortgage on your house, the house is owned by the bank, right? So you got a loan to buy that house. So in the same way, we finance development across countries with financing that we put at the table. For the money that we disburse, we do have our own fiduciary mechanisms to make sure that the money is used for the intended purposes. And I can tell you, in most of the cases, that is the case. So we do have, on the financial management, on the procurement side, very concrete rules that we implement and apply at the country level. In addition to that, we have our own integrity vice presidency within the World Bank that actually works both on the prevention side, but also in investigating cases when things don't go well. This is important not just for our own projects or the projects that we finance, but because we learn from this exercise, and then we can help the countries strengthen their country systems. Most of the money that countries use don't come from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the other international financial institutions. They come from other sources. So we will do very little good if we only focus in ring-fencing our own disbursements. We need to use this as an opportunity to improve the country systems that exist at the country level. So having said that, a few of the examples on the type of instruments that we have. First, we spoke about convening and the need for collective action. So we have launched over a year ago the first anti-corruption for development global partnership. There are over 250 organizations who have joined this partnership, including Transparency International and others. So we are convening and trying to be part of that movement to fight corruption at the global and country level. Second, we are putting all of these together for the discussion with our shareholders. The shareholders are the owners of the World Bank. These are the countries of the world, 188 countries around the world. So there will be a technical brief, we call it. It's a presentation to the board, to the shareholders of the World Bank, on July 8th, where we are going to be discussing this as well at the highest possible level at the World Bank. Third, the country work that we do. And the country work needs to start with the diagnostic tools to understand what is the nature of the problem. So we have created something called CCIAs. This is an acronym for Climate Change Institutional Assessments. So basically, we want to know what are the quality of the institutions behind climate change and what is the countries need to do to improve them. And we also have on the financial management side, the PFM side, a number of instruments that help us align PFM with the climate change agenda, the transparency and anti-corruption. Fourth, anti-corruption is beautiful. We need to be working on that. But if we don't focus on the accountability institutions, in addition to anti-corruption agencies, there is little progress on this. So you may end up with a situation where you have lots of transparency and lots of impunity at the same time. So investing in the institutions of justice and rule of law is super important. Next week, we're going to have our first global forum on justice and the rule of law for a sustainable planet. So it's a very important agenda for us. Fifth, we are now supporting the Brazilian government. They are the chair of the G20 at this point this year. So we are supporting them on this specific agenda of anti-corruption and the green transition. And finally, we have created last year also a new initiative. It's called the Green Accountability Initiative, together with civil society organizations. So everyone needs to be part of the solution.
Thank you. Rule of law, justice, prevention, and action team. How do you prioritize those, and what are you doing at UNODC?
Okay, the first thing to say is, unlike the others, we're not a financier. We are the custodians of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which contains a broad range of tools for fighting, preventing corruption. Now, I'll give you a simple example of what we're doing. Countries need to think about climate action as they design their national anti-corruption strategies. So as we interact with countries, we tell them that. Our natural partners are anti-corruption bodies, government officials who act in the anti-corruption space. The knowledge that's been generated on climate from our side tends to come from ministries of the environment, or more specifically from civil society. So we're at a country level, we're trying to move that knowledge across. At a global level, we're working, all the partners here, trying to sort of stimulate the debate, trying to stimulate the knowledge. I mean, from our side, it's more to inform the anti-corruption world and the general public, but it's building. I've already plugged the paper, the discussion draft, so I won't do it again. We can always put up the QR code for those who missed it. The idea here is we don't have all the answers. We have a lot of issues. We have a lot of questions. What we're doing at a global level, together with partners, we're not doing it alone, none of us are doing this alone, is we are trying to get closer to some of the answers. And by working at a global level, it also gives us the opportunity to actually coalesce more accurately at a country level. If we know what we're doing at a global level, then, and we know what others are doing at a global level, then we can join up much more easily at a country level. So that we're working on. At the moment, our work is primarily educational, primarily building awareness, and it's remarkable. I mean, there's probably quite a lot of knowledgeable, educated people in this room. I'm probably not one of them, but it's remarkable the lack of knowledge people actually have about some of these issues. I mean, you know, you sort of think of forest loss, deforestation, forest projects. The average member of the public thinks planting a tree is always a good thing. Not true. You know, it's that sort of level. I mean, when we start to get to these climate issues, I mean, people read net zero. Oh, great, this company's net zero. You then sort of dig a little bit below the surface, and the first question is, how the hell do they know they're net zero? The calculations don't stand up, the measurements don't stand up. Are we deluding ourselves? And it's just putting those issues on the table. I mean, a lot of people have been doing very, very good work in civil society for quite a while. We, I think, are trying to bring together the international organizations, the people who convene governments, who also quite often are seen widely by citizens as a strong voice, to actually talk on these issues, to actually sort of say, hang on a second, we need to do something here, there is a problem here. Have we got the answers yet? No. I heard a couple of people say more research. If you look at the paper we're plugging, that's pretty much number one, what we've come up with. It's not groundbreaking, but it tells you we're looking for answers. We want answers, and we want all of you who've got an interest here to contribute to developing those answers. And what we're trying to do very much is create the space, both at the global level, but then when we work with countries, create the space for government officials, civil society, private sector to come together and talk about some of these issues. Not everywhere yet, but at least in some countries, particularly in Latin America, we're starting to make a bit of progress there.
Thank you, Tim. I have a lot of questions for you, but I would like to also turn to the audience. If you guys have questions for the panelists, I mean, I think there is a lot of topics. And yeah, I think I have a lot of questions around the matrix, maybe how we can improve the matrix, the learning from the tracking and the budget that you were mentioning, Francine, or also the question of what level are we picking, or is it easier to have large portfolios or large investments or different models to channel that money? I think also we heard about the safeguards, the timeline, and the tension here, no? As Karen, you were also insisting about that, about the pressure to disperse. So how do we balance? Where is the priority? Is it in prevention, or is it in tracking and accountability? So I think there are all of those questions, but I have to give that microphone to the person over there. I think it's the first one. And maybe we take 3 questions, because we need to go back and forth. And if you can introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Vedika. I'm with the OECD, working at the intersection of corruption and development. And my question is to Robbie. You mentioned quite rightly that corruption is a symptom of certain structural drivers, and these are deeply entrenched and won't go away overnight. So I wonder if you think it's also important to tolerate some degree of corruption and having an enhanced risk appetite to actually achieve the development goals that we set out to do in climate.
Hi, I'm Catherine Anderson, also from the OECD. Look, given the scale of the issue, given the breadth and depth of vested interests around, fossil fuels and other activities, I mean, it's absolutely true, Francine, we need more evidence. And we've been doing some interesting work in the OECD, and there are 2 things that are emerging as potential opportunities. The first is, history has taught us that not just multi-stakeholder coalitions, multi-stakeholder groups, but strategic coalitions can really influence and impact change, as long as they're inclusive and as long as they have institutional influence. So I want to ask you if you're seeing that in your field, this is for any of the panellists, where they're emerging. We see the C40, the city, the global mayors groups and others that are sort of new coalitions that are coming out, and we certainly see that these have potential, and they tend to be the most impactful around shared existential threats. The second question is a question about positive deviance. You've talked a lot about why climate is different and more challenging for us. So what is it in the nature of the responses that we are adopting that might be different? And again, in our research, we've seen opportunities around positive deviance. We've been doing community-level research which shows that historical conflicts, for example, around land and resource use, can actually be converted into positive opportunities where you see communities come together with, local entrepreneurs and investors to start using resources, for positive climate, biophysical responses. And so I just wonder if you see any instances of positive deviance in the kind of work that you've been doing, again, for any of the panellists.
Hi, my name is Ling from the London School of Economics. I have a question for all panelists. I think we have talked about one side of tackling corruption, which is preventing misuse of funds and donations. But on the other hand, there are also quite a lot of companies, especially in the private sector, that make announcements or donate to climate action in hopes that they can gain some very favorable policies in return. So how can we address this other side of corruption and also preventing either wealthy nations or private sector companies from having undue influence on the less wealthy countries that receive these funds? Thank you.
Okay, let's take maybe 2 more, and then we take it back here and there. Let's move to the other side.
One more question?
Maybe 2 more questions there. No more from OECD.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Mendoza. I'm from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. for those who know, we're the newest multilateral development bank, and our goal is to have 50% of our projects in climate finance and an investment about $50 billion by 2030. And so that's still a very small amount in terms of the requirements. But my question is, we do invest in two types of things in terms of climate finance. Project financing, which is the regular projects, but we're moving towards policy-based lending. I would like to hear your experiences in policy-based lending, and in terms of the level of corruption where we rely heavily on country systems, and how do you reconcile the urgency of investments in climate finance versus the length of time that we would need in increasing the capacity of these weaker countries who would require this type of support in terms of anti-corruption and governance? Thank you.
So thank you, and I'd like to thank all the speakers and the moderators for this interesting topic today. So I'm Farma Lala from Transparency International Madagascar, and I'd like to speak in the name of us as developing countries. As you know, we are the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate impacts. So I'd like to give more suggestions and more comments about the study that you've shown earlier. So I think that yes, it is a good study, and it can reflect some aspects of how the corruption can relate to some climate action. But actually, I think that it doesn't really reflect. It's my opinion. You may not agree, but I think that in terms of reflecting some climate actions and corruption in climate actions in developing countries, it doesn't really reflect our reality from developing countries. So there is a lot of corruption risks that we should talk about in the sector of climate change. Like, for example, Brice mentioned the corruption which can affect climate issues, for instance, environmental crimes like deforestation. And also there is some corruption that can decrease some confidence in climate action and can conduct to embezzlement. And then I think that we can be more exhaustive in terms of cases that we can reflect to this type of studies, because it is the research that become the actions to tackle really corruption in climate actions. So thank you.
Maybe we do a round. Thank you very much. And but I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Just also a reminder that there will be other climate sessions, no? So also specific questions can be addressed in the next days. And I will park the one question about the kind of positive experiences, because I would like to do just the last round before closing. So putting that one aside. I think the last question, were you referring to the study where there was a QR code, yeah? Or, yeah? Tim, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I'll take that one. It sounds like I've got the easy one. First thing
any
is...
other thing you want to add, sorry. If you want to also respond to any other
I'll take the easy one first.
Okay.
The first thing is the study is really a discussion draft. We really welcome your inputs. We know it's not comprehensive. We didn't aim for it to be comprehensive. We're trying to simply raise the debate, raise the profile of the debate. So please, anyone who's got inputs, bring them forward. We aim to hopefully have something more final, not comprehensive, later in the year. So I hear what you're saying very much. Please let us know what you think. And if you think it's complete rubbish, tell us. Better that we know.
Okay. Maybe, I mean, yeah, all of you feel free to jump in, but maybe there was the question about Maybe the question about undue influence, because I have interest in that one. I mean, there's a session the day after tomorrow on that, or Friday, but maybe if, I don't know if Emmanuel or Robbie or anyone wants to, because you mentioned, I think, policy a couple of times, and also that tension for regarding the question of the time, right? Like, do we have time to make actually structural changes or?
Yeah, I can talk to the undue influence with one specific area of our interest at the IMF. That is a structural one. It's not only related to climate, but more generally and in relation to the funds involved in the climate finance, it's very relevant to climate. It's an initiative, we call it transnational aspects of corruption. Because often in our discussions, we tend obviously to focus on the issues in low-income or countries or countries where corruption is pervasive. But other countries where corruption may not be pervasive do have a major role in ensuring that the system overall works. And if I'm correct, you raised the question of the role of the companies, the multinationals. They, if not properly regulated, there is a risk of bribery of foreign public officials. There is also the role of international financial centers in laundering the proceeds of corruption in general, but also corruption related to climate. In their jurisdictions. So in this regard, the IMF really sees that part, the transnational aspects of corruption, as an integral part of our work to address corruption and governance. Actually, we have a dedicated initiative that is a voluntary initiative, but now more than half of the G20 countries and other countries have volunteered to be assessed in the context of this annual surveillance by the IMF on how they are doing in relation to the bribery of foreign public officials and in relation to the laundering of proceeds of corruption. And I then go to the point that was made on multi-stakeholder approach. This work, we are not doing it at the IMF by ourselves. Actually, we rely entirely for the bribery of foreign public officials on the work of the OECD Working Group on Bribery. And we relate to the work of the Financial Action Task Force and its regional style bodies in relation to the facilitation of proceeds of corruption. So this is for us an important element in the equilibrium of the system we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob, do you want to add something or any other?
Quick reactions, okay, maybe in 1 minute or so. So the first one, very important question about levels of tolerance to corruption. So I'm from Argentina. I'm the only one in this panel coming from a developing country.
No.
No?
South Africa is probably developing.
Well, in fact, every country is developing, right? So let's agree on that. But so we feel it in the flesh, right? And when you see people from our countries, well, let's take a very quick example. They may drive in their own countries without a seatbelt. They travel to Disney World. They arrive in Miami. First thing they do, they rent a car. They put the seat on, right? The seatbelt on. So it's not genetic, right? So the fact that countries and societies have higher levels of tolerance is not a genetic thing, so it can be changed. So I would say you may have some extreme situations, I don't know, a natural disaster in which you need to ensure that the humanitarian aid gets where it needs to get, and you cannot stop that. But that doesn't mean that you are going to tolerate, levels of corruption. So I think that's a point. The second, Catherine, you mentioned I like it, the strategic coalitions, which is not just to have coalitions with everyone. And I think that this brings us the idea that we need to break this idea that government officials are all corrupt, civil society actors are all clean, and the private sector don't care, right? What we need to do is to identify champions in government, champions in civil society and the private sector, so we can actually protect the champions in government against the forces in the same sectors against that. So the coalition is not between, one sector and against another. So a strategic coalition will be identifying, the forces that you want to align to make the change happen. And finally, on the policy-based lending, This is a bit of a jargon for us in this. So this is budget support to countries in exchange of adopting changes, policy changes at the country level, right? So the experience we have is that these become more effective when you can align them in a series of different operations. If you do one off, yes, you're going to have the government maybe implementing a number of reforms because they need the fresh money. But then in many cases you have reversals. So if you can build a series of operations over time, 3, 4, 5 years, then you can actually build what is needed. That over time these institutional changes take a lot of effort and time to stick. So then there will be a longer time horizon for that.
Thank you. Karen, do you wanted to add something about the coalitions or that point or
I would like
anything else?
to jump in on that risk tolerance, because this is a topic that is currently very pertinent for the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund is currently revising its very original, very first risk appetite statement. So there will be something that will be approved by the board, by our board later on this year. And it's a very emotional discussion also among us, because when you ask integrity people, they of course say zero tolerance across the board. And although I do not come from a developing country, I have worked in a number of developing countries. We have a lot of colleagues in the fund that come from developing countries, so they can also tell us a lot about the reality. So we are really boiling it down to really fundamental core integrity standards where the fund really will show zero tolerance and act accordingly. But then we have also have we will have two further levels of this, and this is where the debate lies. So ultimately the answer to your question is, yes, there needs to be, I think, some tolerance to corruption. We need to acknowledge reality and still deliver climate action. It's just, where do we draw the line? So stay tuned for that risk appetite statement later on this year.
Okay. Suspense. Francine, do you want to...
Yeah, I think on the strategic coalitions question, actually I think in the finance and the climate space, we are being more strategic, and there are these higher level coalitions, maybe because it's defined so much at the global level as well as the country level. But of course, we can do a lot more. But I think about, for example, the NDC partnership, which includes some key actors around achieving climate ambition. Or I think around our partnership on integrated national financing frameworks, which is really intended to support countries to really map out the sources of financing and align it with SDGs. Or I actually think about, I think you're from OECD, and I think about our collaboration on Tax Inspectors Without Borders, which is also about working together with a large number of countries and partners to stop tax evasion and to support countries in aligning their revenues with SDGs. So I think there's more going on in this space, but I referred to the portfolio approach earlier because it's rather radical in my view. It's taking a systems approach and saying no agency or organization can do anything by themselves. And given the scale of the crises that we're facing today, we need to come together and we need to go way beyond transactions or projects to really look at how we can deliver together. So that's what I would say about strategic coalitions, but it's a really important question in a very difficult time. And on the risk appetite, I thought that was a good question too. I think we need to increase our risk appetite. I mean, if I think about our delivery of environment and vertical fund, what we call vertical fund initiatives, in fragile or conflict-affected countries, we do less. And I think that's something that we need to address. We need to ensure we provide access to financing in conflict and fragility-affected countries too. And that means, you know, addressing, not just looking at risk in terms of compliance, which oftentimes we do, but really actively managing risk and putting in place measures to mitigate that risk. And they exist. So I don't think I would say I mean, we do have zero tolerance to corruption, but we need to much more. We have to have a bigger risk appetite and more actively manage those risks.
Thank you. There were still a few hands up, so I don't know if they are like pressing. We only have 11 minutes and 3 seconds, and I would like just each of the panelists to just finish on one kind of responding also to the question that I parked before. So how can we also kind of change those risks into maybe opportunities in doing things differently and better? And but if there are kind of one or two burning questions, or even better comments or suggestions to also what the different organizations around the table or others should be doing, including civil society and others. Okay, I see two hands, so let's take those two questions or suggestions, and then we will hear a closing remark.
Thank you. It's John Hawkins from COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. On Thursday, all being well, we'll be releasing a set of data points to help open up climate finance investments, mainly infrastructure, adaptation, mitigation, but also decommissioning, which is not being mentioned, and some guidance around that. And really the question we're now thinking about, so this will work very closely as an extension to the Open Contracting for Infrastructure data standard. But one of the questions we're starting to think about is, given the complexity of the finance, given the it's really the civil society capacity to track, monitor these investments. So any suggestions from the panelists be grateful for. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was another hand.
Thanks all. I'm Amis Adranjad from Tehran Chamber of Commerce. Listening to you all guys, I was thinking about the role of due diligence in minimizing the risk of corruption and giving the loans to the companies or firms or things like this. Can you, one of you, anyone, explain the role of due diligence in this point to minimize the risk? Thanks.
Thank you so much for the questions and the suggestions. So we have 8 minutes 28 seconds. So and yeah, let's try as one of the speakers I think this morning said, let's not be all doom and gloom. So just trying to be also to see or learn from positive. If you have some positive examples, if you have some ideas on how to change those risks into opportunities, and I think it's also a timely conversation, especially for the bank or other organizations, on how to kind of reinvent the way we do things. Who is first?
I'll go first.
Okay, Tim, thanks.
I'll be quick.
1 minute each. Yeah.
Basically, if we look at COVID-19, it created a lot of opportunities for strengthening procurement systems. I think on the green procurement, there's an opportunity to get it right. There's an opportunity to strengthen the system. But what we need is knowledge. We need research, we need knowledge, we need awareness. The way I see it is, if you bury your head in the sand now, what are you going to do when the sand gets too hot? Okay.
Thank you. Karen, nice to see you. Yeah.
On the role of due diligence in the Green Climate Fund, what do? We have, first of all, we have a very rigorous accreditation process where entities that want to access climate finance are checked really in depth by an external accreditation panel that makes a recommendation to the board whether they meet the standards, the core standards of the organization. And when I say core standards, these are the core fiduciary standards that everybody has to meet. Now, because of the pressure of climate finance, we are also looking into other access modalities, so how also entities can access easier. climate finance other than through a rigorous accreditation process. And there we are actually also at the discussion, how can we still undertake our role of due diligence, which we have. I mean, we receive a lot of public money, and there we are looking, of course, at legal frameworks, and then really also proactive tracking and really checking our entities. But that is a challenge.
Thank you. Rob, I see you moving. It's your turn.
My turn. Okay. So I will say what Elizabeth Taylor said when she got married for the 8th time. I'll be brief. Okay. So basically, that was a joke. Thank you. So a number of things that I think I'm very hopeful. It's a very difficult agenda, but I'm hopeful. A number of things that we are going to move forward with. First is the music is for us.
It's for you.
Thank you very much. So I may change the tone. So first, we need to invest more in our work with strengthening the role of accountability institutions at the country level. We cannot be the police, the global police of this agenda. We need the local institutions to be working on this. Second, we are going to be working a lot more on issues related to beneficiary ownership transparency and illicit financial flows. A lot of this is related to climate change and contracts at the country level. The third one has to do with working with others, continuing our partnership with UNODC for the production of this paper and other work, working together with EITI. We continue working with them on this agenda, very important for us. Number 4 is the issue of technology. You mentioned this before, and I think that we need to do more on this. We have a program specifically on GovTech and the use of technology for detecting corruption and patterns of corruption, also for climate change. And finally, we have an agreement with a number of organizations convening international fora like this, TI, Open Government Partnership, the OECD, the World Bank, others, that from conference to conference, we see that we need to do better by aligning this discussion. So the agreement we have is that every organization who is the next to organize the next conference, in this case the World Bank, because we have our upcoming forum on anti-corruption in February, is going to be in charge of the coordination among all these shareholders. So my commitment to you is that this is going to be a salient, very prominent topic on this policy dialogue agenda at international level. Thanks.
Thank you. Francine, do you want to? Yeah?
I'm trying to think of an example of positive deviance, but I'm not sure I can. I would just finish by giving the example of some work we're doing in carbon markets, which is very high risk, but it's also high demand. And we're getting a lot of requests from countries where we work, developing countries, for support in how to negotiate the work around carbon markets. So we issued a high integrity carbon markets initiative, which is basically setting up principles and guidelines for how to engage in this space. And it's helping countries in navigating this, trying to get a fair price, negotiate strongly in the interests of their country and in support of the NDCs. So I think this is a really important area coming up, and an area where we definitely need a focus on integrity.
Thank you, definitely. Yeah. Emmanuel, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I have a quote with me from our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva. And that's on climate in general. And she says, business as usual is not delivering what we need to prevent catastrophic consequences. And I do think that anti-corruption as usual will not deliver what we need in the response to the climate challenge. And the optimistic part is that we have all us present here and in these meetings from the different quarter where we can bring our collective brain and intelligence to try to find solutions which would be effective not only on climate but on the global infrastructure in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you here on the panel. I think it was very nice to have you all here and hear commitments as well, and commitments we will do better, and we have to definitely to do better, especially in that field. You mentioned carbon markets, you mentioned also the infrastructure. I mean, there will be, as I was saying, a number of sessions in the next days, so I invite you to also join the other session on environment and climate, and thanks to the ICC for also putting those topics strongly on the agenda. There is also one of the efforts that we are also contributing to in kind of bringing these two communities together is the Countering Environmental Corruption Practitioners Forum, where all of you are also welcome to join. You can just Google that name if you haven't heard, and it's basically kind of trying to have those conversations, bringing practitioners from the two world or the two practices together. So yeah, hopefully see you there, and thank you for still being with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.